Hi everyone, it's Dr. Diane again with our second ACE approved unit for BACB certificates. So remember, if you are looking to acquire CEUs for this presentation, you will need to watch this entire 50-minute presentation from beginning until end. And be on the lookout for 2 secret code words. They'll come up intermittently on a card like this. I mean, they won't be blank like this. I'll have a word written on it. So what you need to do is you need to copy those 2 words. And at the end of the presentation, you need to give these words to Rachel Marlowe, who will know then that you've watched the whole video. At the same time that you contact Rachel, she will be available to give you the research articles that we have discussed in this presentation. This presentation is also what I will call a serious nerd alert. Here he is, Nikki the Nerd. So what this means is there are going to be points during this presentation where there will be a big question mark in front of your face. And your covert verbal behavior will be something like this. What the heck is she talking about? But this is okay because this stuff is not very easy. And I'm going to do my very best to clarify, but it's still very difficult stuff. So this unit is called ACT, Acceptance and Commitment Therapy. Embracing your inner conflicts through using your covert verbal behavior. This is really for serious ABA geeks like me. So ACT, we're going to call it ACT because it's much simpler to do that than to keep referring to it as acceptance and commitment therapy. So we're going to call it ACT, or I'm going to call it ACT for the rest of this presentation. ACT is based directly on another acronym, RFT, or Relational Frame Theory, which is very cumbersome to understand. And this unit is an introduction, so I'm going to be as practical as possible. I'm not going to delve too deep into those RFT waters, not this time. So what we need to know is that both ACT and RFT are based on a behaviorist tradition. Now, behaviorism, as we know, has its own very complex vocabulary. And RFT and ACT have their own separate vocabulary, so it becomes a bit complex and complicated. So Einstein, I hope you know who he is, Einstein once said that the intricacies of science must be able to be explained to a barmaid. So on that note, I'll have the Chardonnay. So when some of us hear the acronym ACT, or Acceptance and Commitment Therapy, we often think about feelings. And yes, that's important. ACT is based upon feelings, but it's also very, very heavily based upon what we actually do. So, ACT is, number 1, is a third wave psychological approach. I'm going to discuss all 3, so don't worry. Hang in there. Stay with me a while. Number 2, ACT is rooted in our behavioral tradition. Number 3, ACT is based on a specific philosophic science known as functional contextualism. I'll say that again because it's actually very important. ACT is based on a tradition known as functional contextualism. The theoretical form of ACT is RFT, or Relational Frame Theory. Now, Relational Frame Theory extends upon the work of our good friend Skinner. Hope you remember him. Skinner's work on verbal behavior, and it expands on some of the weaknesses of this theory. Sorry, Dr. Skinner, but there are some weaknesses with that. So here we have our friend Nikki the Nerd. Serious nerd alert here. Have you read Verbal Behavior by Skinner? It's a wonderful theory. Wonderful constructs, intraverbals, echoics, and manding. It's wonderfully constructed. But there's not a lot of practical information there. So what ACT does instead to expand upon this theory of verbal behavior is to tap into an entirely new process of change that we're going to call the transactional treatment model. I'll say it again, the transactional treatment model. So for the next 50 minutes, I will discuss the following. The 3 waves of psychology. Number 2, some fundamental ACT interventions that you can use with families of children with autism. 3, some interesting research on ACT. And lastly, some really fun ACT activities. So let's get your surfboards and let's ride those 3 waves of psychology. Are you ready? The first wave. So the first wave begins with a man called Freud. Again, I hope you remember who he is. We'll just call him Siggy. Now, this wave began with Freud and his friends. These were people who established psychodynamic intervention. Now, we as behavior analysts know that there was a problem with this. There was a problem because this particular approach was not rooted in observable science. We know that. Secondly, this approach was not rooted in any real treatment protocol. So there's no real information on how this intervention could change anything. So we all know theory is so nice. We need theory. But what exactly do we do with it? So the only real questions for behavior analysts are, number 1, does this really work? And number 2, does this really do anything? So for our purposes, we will say that Freud, although he is part of this first wave, we're not really going to consider him a psychologist. We're going to consider him a philosopher. And again, serious Nikki nerd alert, Freud based his theories on the work of other philosophers like Nietzsche and Kant and Rousseau and all of those brainy guys who were talking about raison d'être and autre chose. Pardon my French, literally, pardon my French. But what Kant did and what Freud was very invested in was Kant felt that reason, human reason, was what would lead to free will and what we call determinism. Okay, guys, you studied for your BCBA exam, at least I'm hoping you did. So, what is determinism? Okay, real simple. All behavior has a cause, and thus all behavior is predictable. Now, radical behaviorism states that free will is an illusion. Our behavior is governed by internal forces, biologic forces, and also by external forces like parental influence and the media. And these are forces over which we don't really have any control. That's the idea. Whether it's true or not, we really don't know. So this all sounds really interesting, right? It all sounds very, very interesting philosophically. But if this were true, if we had no free will and no choice, why would we need prisons? Why would we need parking tickets? If our behavior is completely out of our own control. So all of this is really cool if you're a really heavy intellectual. But how do you research any of this? So, Skinner came along in reaction to this philosophy. So we're going to consider him part of that first wave of psychology. He reacted to psychodynamic approaches because he wanted an observable science with a real intervention attached to it. So this is true. Skinner wanted an observable science. He wanted intervention attached to it. But Skinner didn't work with people. He postulated about language, but he didn't do any research on it. So there were, and there continue to be, behavior analysts who do not believe that the three-point contingency is really enough to explain human behavior. So, Skinner is part of the first wave. He reacted to Freud and his friends. And so now we have the second wave of psychology, cognitive behaviorism. And why do we need that? Because there are major problems with just treating observable behavior. The main problem the cognitive behaviorists had was they couldn't really explain cognition or language by describing observable behavior alone. That was their big question. So one of the goals for cognitive behaviorists was to clearly define cognition and language. Strict behaviorism is a very mechanical approach, beginning with motivation and cascading to the consequence. Yet, at the end, do we really know what provoked a human behavior? We live in a context where there could be many, many causes for that behavior. So in the second wave, we have a metaphor. We have the mind as a computer, and this computer is used to process all of the information around us. Now, the mind as a computer is a very useful metaphor, but it really should not be our only metaphor. So if Skinner were the first wave, a man named Albert Bandura was the second wave. And what Albert Bandura did was he made a very good connection between behavior and cognition. He's very famous for his Bobo doll experiment. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but we should be. He had this big balloon, this big bozo balloon that you swing back and forth. And what he did was he had parents or other adults react in an aggressive manner towards this doll, like punching the doll very swiftly. And he had children observe this behavior. And he also had a second group of parents or adults come in and treat the doll very affectionately. So what happened with this experiment was that children who viewed the aggressive adults behaved aggressively towards the bozo doll. Children who observed adults behaving affectionately towards the bozo doll did the same to the bozo doll afterwards. So what this experimentation confirmed was that human beings were not only exposed to operant conditioning, meaning that learning was not just a function of operant conditioning, reinforcement and punishment. Learning could be a function of observation. So we could learn things by just looking at other people. We didn't necessarily need to be reinforced or punished for a behavior. So this was a very, very important study. So, before dipping our big toe into that third wave of psychology, let's just examine how the first two waves were similar to each other. Okay, so we have behaviorism and cognitive behaviorism. So traditional behaviorism is focused on behavior. What we want to do is we want to change behavior. We want to increase it or decrease it, but we want to modify observable behavior. Cognitive behaviorism basically wants to do the same thing, but we want to change basically about how we feel about those behaviors as well. Now, both of these approaches, traditional behaviorism and cognitive behaviorism, want to reduce suffering or symptoms. And this last idea is what really makes the third wave of psychology so very different. In the third wave, we don't really want to reduce suffering or symptoms. I know that sounds a little bit weird, but truly that's not what the intention is with the third wave. Rather, what we want to do with this third wave of psychology, of which ACT is a part, is we want to help people change their relation to the symptoms or to the suffering. So, for example, there's much research on ABA on changing the behavior of depression. And truly, that's what this research does. That's what it accomplishes. By using a good program of behavior analysis, of applied behavior analysis, we can reduce the observable behaviors of depression. So the depressed behavior is reduced. We've done what we're supposed to do. Some people do feel better. They report they feel better. But most self-reports made by folks whose depressed behavior was reduced by ABA indicate that they are still depressed. So, question. Do people cry because they're sad? Or are they sad because they cry? Now, Skinner did think about this question, so even 60 years ago, his response to this question was that the environment was supporting the sadness or the crying, and that's why it continued to exist. So Skinner was thinking about context even 60 years ago. So let's think a minute. Suppose you have a family who has a child with autism. So, can we help this mother by reducing her feelings or her behaviors of sadness and worry for her child? Or do we help this mother accept her feelings and teach her how to work with them? You have a handicapped child. Isn't it normal for you to feel sad and for you to be worried about this person? So it may be quite an injustice to think families will feel better after they implement these ABA programs and their child's behavior improves. Now will all the sadness and worry go away? I mean, that could be a good theory, but research tells us that that's not really what happens. What the research indicates is that the more we push parents to complete complicated ABA interventions, the worse it actually becomes for them. Maybe not for the child, but for the family it does. They become more stressed and they feel more inadequate. But that research on parental stress is probably for another CEU unit. So let's move on from there. We're going to accept the fact that ignoring the feelings of the parents is not the best way to intervene. Now, thoughts and feelings are behavior. Skinner told us this. Private events are defined by covert verbal behavior. So all of this covert verbal behavior is swimming around in our heads like signposts on the road, asking a couple of questions. Are you living the life that you want? And let's attach new meaning around what is troubling you or creating conflict. Okay. Here it is. Our secret code word is smile. S-M-I-L-E. So keep this first code word for Rachel at the end. Okay. So these signposts on the road to our having a good life ask us, are you living the life that you want? And how can you develop better meaning around what's troubling you? What's creating conflict for you? And you know what? ACT gives us a process on how we can actually approach this and change this. So what we do in ACT that we don't do with the other first two waves of psychology is we don't attempt to reduce the suffering directly. We don't tell the person that these are not good feelings to have. We let the person keep their feelings, but change their perspective surrounding them. What we try to do is alter the experience or the function of the experience without truly replacing it. So, okay, more examples. How many of us cook? All right, don't worry. You don't need to be a good cook to understand the rest. I'm just going to use this as a metaphor. So, traditional behaviorism is you have all of these ingredients, and you take each one of the ingredients and you consume them separately. You have eggs and flour and salt and vanilla. And if you're trying to bake a cake, you know at the end you're not going to have any sort of cake. You're not going to have anything that tastes like a cake. Yet, you have all of the ingredients. So with ACT, you have all of the same ingredients, but you combine them in a very specific manner with emphasis on the function of the experience. So, virtually every addictive behavior is some form of avoidance, some form of negative reinforcement. So when we smoke or drink or consume a great deal of unhealthy food, we often do this to eliminate unpleasant feelings. And then the endorphins produced by engaging in these addictive behaviors reinforce this behavior so it continues in this kind of vicious cycle. So, ACT does something a little bit different. It uses a functional, contextual approach with the behavioral equation being something like this. So here we go. I've got my visual aids here, and I'll go over this with an example, but I'm just going to go through it. I'm vulnerable. And I have prompting events as a result of being vulnerable. Then I have links or things that surround the prompting events, ideas, covert verbal behavior that surrounds that event. I have a behavior and I have a consequence. So let me repeat that with an example. I'll use the addictive behavior because it's very easy to illustrate this using that. It's very easy with a functional equation to indicate how addictive behavior is reinforced. So, I'm vulnerable. I'm stressed. I feel alone. No one can help me. This is the covert verbal behavior we have. Prompting events. I have alcohol in my house, and the drink will make me feel better because I know that before it's made me feel better. The links to the covert verbal behavior might be remembering former events where drinking has made you feel better. So now, the behavior, we drink. And the consequences are that we have endorphins, which will now reinforce that experience. Now, the real work is done in the links component, where there are memories, good and bad, can emerge, remembering the times when drinking did not make you feel good, as well as the memories where drinking made you feel a lot better. Now, if we use a traditional ABA behaviorist model, we can reduce the drinking. We can certainly do that. But drinking is really not the problem here. It is a manifestation of the problem, but it's not the problem. The problem is the vulnerability and the covert verbal behavior that triggers the prompting and the ensuing behavior. So we can treat and manipulate the observable behavior, but we may not be able to help that person feel better about their life. And in many instances, this person will return to drinking, or they will substitute another addictive behavior because the observable behavior is not really the problem. So, I'm assuming here that most of you watching this video, or at least many of you, are working with children with autism. Maybe some of you are working with people with addiction, but I'm assuming that most of you are working with families with children with ASD. So you might be thinking, well, how could this work with families who have a child with autism? So let's take some other examples. So you are working at home with a family with a 3-year-old boy with autism, and you would like the mother to participate more in the ABA program. However, this mom is cleaning the whole day long. The moment her husband leaves for work, she starts cleaning. She cannot seem to find even 20 minutes per day to play or work with her child. So, what can you do? Do you think that manipulating things so that she cleans less is the best solution? Or let's take this example. What about the parent who leaves her child all day with the iPad. Now, we can put the iPad on extinction. Have we solved the problem? Now, I would never mean to indicate that ABA in itself is not an exemplary treatment. But we should be able to borrow from our behavioral toolbox to use other interventions which could make our current intervention more effective for the entire family. I say that because of the many professionals that I work with who are involved in treatment and intervention with families, and it seems that one continual lament is that they can't get their families to be really invested in the treatment. It's a constant lament. So I'd like to describe what we can do. Again, this is an introduction to acceptance and commitment therapy, so I can't really delve too deep into the situation. I'm just giving you an overview here. But we would begin with a baseline, and this is what we call our life enhancement exercise record. Our life enhancement exercise record. So for me, this life enhancement exercise record starts as a kind of baseline and eventually becomes a probe for manipulating covert verbal behavior. So here's the program. At the end of each day, please make a rating for each of the following 4 questions using the following scale. This is similar or even identical to a Likert scale. A rating for each question that ranges from 0, not at all, or goes all the way to 10, a substantial or an extreme amount. And there are 4 categories: suffering, struggle, workability, and valued action. So you start with suffering. And the question is, how upset or distressed were you today overall? Again, 0 to 10. Number 2, struggle. How much effort did you put into making troubled feelings or thoughts go away today? Did you suppress those feelings? Did you distract yourself? Did you reassure yourself? Did you ask for reassurance from other people? Number 3, workability. If life in general were like today, to what degree would today be part of a vital, workable day of living for you? And lastly, valued action. How much have you engaged in behaviors or actions today that are in accord with your valued life system? And, like good behavior analysts, we can make a graph of this. I'm sorry. I'm bothered with my bangs, excuse me. Anyway, here it is. Here is our graph. You can see that we have suffering in blue, struggle in red, workability in black, and valued action in green. So we start over here in August, and we come all the way, no, we start in September, and we go all the way to August of the following year. So, not a quick process, it takes time. But you can see that over here in August, we have extreme amounts of suffering and struggle, which gradually dips in June, and at that same time, we have more workability and valued action. Now, this doesn't come about by itself. It comes about with your using the ACT intervention with the family, and very gradually the covert verbal behavior of the family, the struggle doesn't disappear. The suffering doesn't disappear, but you manage it better and you adjust your covert verbal behavior. So I hope the graph was somewhat clear. So if you look at the colors and the graph, you can see that Mrs. Z, it could be Mrs. ABC, it doesn't really matter. She's moving away from suffering and struggle and towards workability and valued action. Her feelings have not changed in a sense that she does have the same covert verbal behavior, but she's accepted it and manipulated to a place where she's committed to some action. So let's take a walk through that. So Mrs. ABC's original covert behavior was something like this. My child has autism. He will always suffer. He will never be like anyone else, and he will be alone. He will be without friends. New covert verbal behaviors. My son has autism. He will always be different. He will never be like anybody else, but he will have friends. So Mrs. Z is told to keep her feelings that they're valid and that they're important. And if somebody dies, you mourn. If you try to suppress these feelings or avoid them, you may engage in distracting behaviors like cleaning, or you may even try to avoid your own child by locking him into an iPad all day because you're not really acknowledging what you truly are worried about. And these are real worries. So again, we can help reduce the cleaning behavior or put the iPad on extinction. But the mom could still feel very hopeless about her child. So what have we really accomplished if that's all we look at is the observable behavior of the parent? So before we get to some of the ACT activities, let's have a look at some of the research. There are two research articles which look at the parents of children with autism. There's a lot of other ACT research, but it looks at other illnesses or addiction or, people with mental illness or people with physical problems. But I felt it important to look at the articles that talk about families with children with autism. So the first article is Gould, Tarbucks, and Coyne. It's a very new article. It's from 2018. And this study was the first one to examine the effects of ACT on the value-directed overt behavior of parents of children with autism. A concurrent multiple baseline design across participants was used to evaluate treatment effectiveness. And there were notable increases in overt values-directed behavior. It was observed in all participants. And gains were maintained post-treatment 6 months after the project was ended. There was a follow-up, and there were notable increases in this even after 6 months. And the exploratory data suggest that there were possible decreases in experiential avoidance and increases in self-compassion. So the concept presented in this research is that parents have psychological distress, which is described by high levels of aversive private events evoked by environmental stressors. Now, contingency-shaped behavior is controlled by direct exposure to environmental contingency. Really simple. Put your hand on the stove, you don't do it again because you have immediate punishment. That's a contingency-based behavior. What you also have is rule-governed behavior. Rule-governed behavior is very different. We do something because we have language, and we do it because we're told to do it. So parents can continue to behave in inflexible ways because they have a rule. They have covert verbal behavior telling them, good parents don't behave this way. So, for example, I can't stand this anymore. Good parents shouldn't behave this way. So when I'm outside with my child and my child acts up, I'm going to worry about what everybody else is thinking about me rather than what is really the important thing to do in this situation. And it's really being controlled not so much by the behavior of my child, but by the covert verbal behavior that I have. So many parents will try to terminate their adverse private events by avoiding them altogether. Not being available for meetings, not coming to trainings, avoiding work with their child. So we do need to remember that the use of ACT is in its infancy with families with children with autism. There were only 3 participants in this particular study, and each was asked to evaluate, to actualize a value. So for example, I want quality time for myself. And the definition of this quality time was any leisure activity without my child. And the action was an exercise class, a manicure, time with my friends. Sorry. And there were various ACT activities that were used to define and actualize these values. And I'll talk about those a little bit later. So in this particular study, the parents were given 6 ACT sessions over the course of 6 weeks. And the results of the study indicate that this 6-week ACT protocol produced robust increases in value-directed behavior from the parents. Furthermore, increases in this value-directed behavior were maintained and accelerated in the follow-up. This is very important information. So it is important to remember that Skinner intended that there be a complete science of behavior that included private events, yet there are still very few studies that attempt to consider this variable. The second study, I can't really pronounce these names that well, but it's Shubrata, Sina, and Malkirk, also very new, 2018. This study had very similar results. These families with adolescents were included. The study had a slightly larger sample, 5 participants instead of 3. And the intervention was slightly longer. It was 10 weeks instead of 6, so nearly 50% more. So this study examined anxiety, depression, and psychological flexibility. And the results were also very similar, with post-treatment results more dramatic than the initial results. So both studies indicate that ACT may have promise in helping parents address to the difficulties of raising children with ASD. It is also important to remember that these studies had very small samples, so there's a lot more research to be done and replicated. So the idea here is that the ACT protocol will help families shape their covert verbal behavior to move towards workability and towards taking real action in the environment that will reduce their stress, anxiety, and depression. And for these small samples, it did seem to do just that. Sorry, it's time for our second code word. Second code word is butterfly. B-U-T-T-E-R-F-L-Y. Save this, give it to Rachel at the end of this. Okay, so now we're going to go on to some ACT activities. And I want to emphasize that these are just examples. Ideally, you would match the ACT activities to the person, to the family that you were working with. But these are three sort of general beginning activities. So, the first ACT, I love this, ACT activity. I'm not stuttering, it's just ACT activity. The first ACT activity is called the Wheel of Awareness. So you sit in a comfortable position, you close your eyes, and you become aware of your breathing. Each one of these ACT activities requires this. Sit comfortably, close your eyes, and concentrate on your breathing. The second part is you visualize a wheel with 4 quadrants and a center that we'll call a hub. In quadrant 1, there are our 5 senses. So we ask the question, what do you hear? What can you smell or taste? Now open your eyes, what can you see? Quadrant 2 is bodily sensations. It's kind of our 6th sense. Do you feel hot or cold? Do you feel numb? Do you feel tense? Quadrant 3 is our mental activity, our hopes, our dreams, our attitudes. Are these mental activities, are they consistent? Are you thinking this way all the time? Or do these impressions come and go? Now, at the center of this wheel is the hub. And this is supposed to symbolize yourself. What knowledge about yourself have you acquired so far in thinking about these 3 quadrants? Quadrant 4 is your connections to other people. Those close, those far, and those loved ones. What do you think about all of this? What impressions do you have? Now, you bring your attention back to yourself after thinking about all of these different things. This is just to tap into your covert verbal behavior. You write everything down, and then you have a discussion. How did I feel after this exercise? What did I learn about myself? And 3, how could I apply this to my everyday life? Okay. Exercise 2 is what we call leaves on a stream. And again, you sit comfortably, you close your eyes, you concentrate on your breathing, and then you visualize that there's a stream floating by, and there are leaves on top of this stream. Now, everything that comes into your mind, you place on top of a leaf. And this includes things like extraneous thoughts like, gee, this is stupid, or boy, am I bored. Put all of these thoughts on your leaves and allow your thoughts to float away from you. Okay, now come back out of this and you have questions. Were you able to do this? Were there any new thoughts that popped up during this exercise? How do you feel now? Okay, the last exercise is called Eye of the Hurricane. Sit comfortably, close your eyes, attention on your breathing. Now we're going to use a metaphor of the eye of the hurricane or the eye of the storm. You become the center of the storm or the center of the hurricane. You are going to observe all of the turbulence around you, but you're going to be calm. You're going to observe. You're not going to participate. And you have questions. Can you resonate with this metaphor? What kinds of experiences surfaced for you? So all of this information, each one of these exercises, you write everything down. And if you're working one-on-one with the family or you have a small group, which is actually excellent for this, you describe what you have. You describe your verbal behavior. And every month you come and you do a probe and you see what changes. That's kind of the overview of this very, very involved technique known as ACT. So I'm very mellow now. I've been talking very softly so that you can get in touch with your covert verbal behavior. So we've come to the end of our second ACE unit. I hope you have all learned something new and that you will tune in for more ACE units from Erica Tober. So bye-bye now and have a great day and stay tuned in to your covert verbal behavior. See you next time.